was in a hospital with some kind of ailment. So I thought it'd be a nice gesture to go visit him.
Oh, I don't know. I mean, it could have come off maybe a couple cemetery tombstones.
He was not just a songwriter. He was the voice that redefined music, turned protest into poetry, and made generations believe in the power of words. But behind Bob Dylan's quiet smile and cryptic interviews was a private list, not of rivals or critics, but of artists he once admired, trusted, even loved, legends who crossed a line so deep he never forgave them. For decades he stayed silent, until now. Because at 84, Dylan is not chasing headlines. He is exposing the names that haunted him, the betrayals that shaped him, and the stories the public was never supposed to hear. Eric Clapton. On the surface, Bob Dylan and Eric Clapton seemed destined to be kindred spirits. They were not just two of the greatest names of their generation. They were artists who had reshaped music in completely different but equally seismic ways. Dylan, the master poet who turned folk into something revolutionary. Clapton, the guitarist who pulled blues out of smoky clubs and pushed it onto the biggest stages in the world. When the two appeared together, it felt like history colliding in real time. They shared festival bills, sat in on impromptu jams, and even talked about recording more seriously together. Clapton once went on record calling Dylan the greatest poet in modern music, a remark fans still quote as one of the sincerest compliments ever paid to Dylan. Dylan, usually a man of few public endorsements, praised Clapton's guitar work as being almost untouchable. To outsiders, the mutual admiration looked solid, almost like the beginning of a brotherhood built on artistry. But as is often the case in Dylan's world, the cracks started forming where no one could see them. In the late 70s, Dylan was in a period of transition. He was moving away from the mainstream expectations that had defined him for over a decade, leaning into gospel-inspired records like Slow Train Coming, and surrounding himself with themes of spirituality, sin, and salvation. While critics were divided, some calling it bold, others mocking it as strange and heavy-handed, Dylan did not care. He believed in the work. Behind the scenes, a rumor began to circulate. According to insiders, Clapton, speaking candidly to a producer and perhaps under the influence of a few drinks, said something that Dylan would never forget. Clapton reportedly claimed that Dylan had lost his edge, that the fire which once set the world on fire with songs like Blowing in the Wind and Like a Rolling Stone had dimmed, and worse still, Clapton allegedly hinted that the crown of rock's poet laureate was up for grabs. Maybe, just maybe, he was the one to inherit it. Whether Clapton meant it arrogantly or casually is unclear. Some who were present suggested he spoke offhand, not realizing the weight of his words. Others insist that Clapton, then riding high on solo success with albums like Slow Hand, genuinely believed he was ready to step into Dylan's shadow. Either way, the damage was done. Word got back to Dylan, and he did not take it lightly. Dylan was a man who lived by loyalty. Criticism from critics never fazed him. He had been booed off stages, written off by newspapers, and mocked endlessly by those who did not understand his constant reinvention. But betrayal from someone he respected cut differently. Almost overnight, plans for a quiet, collaborative recording session were cancelled. No explanation, no rescheduling. Insiders claim Dylan never addressed the incident with Clapton directly. He simply withdrew, retreating into that cold silence he used so effectively against those who crossed him. For Dylan, Clapton's public charm and gentlemanly demeanor suddenly felt like masks, hiding ambition and calculation. Once you betrayed his trust, the warmth was gone forever. What makes this feud even more fascinating is how subtle it remained. Unlike other artists Dylan distanced himself from, there was no dramatic public fallout between the two. They did not exchange barbs in interviews or turn their anger into diss tracks. Instead, it was the absence that spoke volumes. Opportunities that might have united them in the studio never happened. Invitations that could have revived their partnership quietly disappeared. Fans, though unaware of the real reason, noticed that Dylan and Clapton, two icons who could have created magic together, remained strangely distant for decades. Looking back, it is easy to see why Dylan reacted the way he did. To him, the remark was not just a critique, it was a betrayal wrapped in ambition. A peer he trusted had not only questioned his artistry, but hinted at replacing him. For Dylan, the idea of being usurped was not something he could ignore. His world was not built on applause, but on authenticity and loyalty. Once Clapton crossed that invisible line, Dylan treated him less like an ally and more like an opportunist waiting to take his place. The tension between them was never resolved. They would occasionally cross paths at events, exchange polite words, even share a stage from time to time. But for Dylan, the bond was broken. Clapton might have been one of the greatest guitarists alive, but to Dylan, he was no longer a trusted equal. He was someone who revealed ambition where there should have been respect. In Dylan's book, that made him unforgettable, but not in the way Clapton would have wanted. But Clapton was not the only ally who turned into a painful memory. The next betrayal came not from backstage whispers, but from someone Dylan once loved deeply. The queen of folk herself, Joan Baez. Joan Baez. In the early 1960s, Bob Dylan and Joan Baez were more than just musicians. They were the face of a movement. When they walked on stage together, hand in hand, it was not just a concert, it was a rallying cry. Their voices blended in ways that seemed almost fated. Baez's crystal soprano soaring over Dylan's rough nasal lines, turning protest songs into hymns for a generation. Together, they sang at civil rights marches, stood at the forefront of anti-war protests, and became symbols of hope for millions of young people searching for meaning in a turbulent America. Their romance, though complicated, only added to the myth. They were not just the queen and king of folk music, they were the embodiment of conscience and resistance, and their names became inseparable in the public imagination. But by 1965, Dylan had changed. That summer at Newport, he walked on stage with an electric guitar and forever rewrote the rules. The sound was raw, loud, and unlike anything the folk faithful expected. He was booed, criticized, and branded a sellout by purists who felt betrayed. Joan Baez was among those who felt the sting. For her, music was more than melody. It was activism, a tool for justice. Dylan's shift to surreal personal poetry, full of cryptic images and dreamlike verses, felt like abandonment of the cause they had built together. She tried to pull him back, urging him to remember the power of protest songs, to reconnect with the political spirit that had defined his rise. When he did not, the frustration boiled over. In interviews, Baez criticized Dylan's new direction. She framed it as selfish, even accusing him of walking away from responsibility. For her, it was not just about art. It was about loyalty to the movement, and loyalty to her. The pain was not one-sided. She had been the one who helped elevate Dylan in his early days, inviting him on stage when audiences still barely knew his name. She had championed his songs, defended him, and carried him into the spotlight with her own reputation. Watching him pivot so sharply felt to her like betrayal, both personal and political. To Dylan, the sting cut even deeper because of who she was. Criticism from critics never rattled him. He had faced it since his first appearance with an electric guitar. But when it came from Joan Baez, someone who had shared not just his stage but his private doubts and insecurities, it felt like a wound from inside his own house. He did not respond in interviews, did not write songs to lash back, did not air dirty laundry. Dylan's revenge was subtler and colder. He froze her out. For more than 4 decades, Dylan refused to truly collaborate with her again. Their joint appearances dwindled to nothing. Invitations were ignored. Opportunities were passed over. He never needed to make a scene. The silence said everything. When pressed about their rift years later, Dylan finally let slip a single line. She sang for the people. I was singing for myself. It was a revealing statement. To Baez, the mission had always been bigger than music. To Dylan, music was the mission. His mission, deeply personal, constantly evolving. When she demanded he stay chained to the cause, he saw it as betrayal of the freedom he valued most. The tragedy of their fracture is how much it cost both of them. Together they had been unstoppable. Their voices carried not just melodies but movements. Apart they remained legends in their own right, but the magic of their partnership never returned. Fans dreamed of reconciliation, of one more duet that might bridge the gap. But Dylan's silence stretched for decades. For Dylan, this was not just a falling out with a fellow musician. It was the severing of a bond that once defined his public identity. Joan Baez represented the youthful idealist inside him, the activist who sang for causes larger than himself. Turning away from her was not just turning away from a person, it was turning away from that version of Bob Dylan altogether. If Baez represented a ghost of Dylan's past, the next name on his hidden list represented something even more dangerous. An artist who mocked him publicly, dismissing his legacy, not with betrayal, but with scorn. Lou Reed. If Joan Baez wounded Dylan with personal betrayal, Lou Reed attacked him with something Dylan despised even more: mockery. Lou Reed was never the kind of artist who played nice. As frontman of the Velvet Underground, he carved out a reputation as a fearless experimenter, a man who would say anything, however sharp, however brutal, however unpopular. Reed did not just write songs, he used them like knives, cutting into culture, politics, and the very idea of what music should be. That brash honesty made him a hero to some and intolerable to others. When it came to Bob Dylan, Reed did not hold back. In a 1974 interview, Reed dismissed Dylan outright, saying his lyrics were nothing more than smoke and mirrors. He claimed Dylan's reputation as a poet was built on illusion, not substance, and went even further by suggesting that Dylan's work represented self-importance rather than genuine meaning. It was not just criticism, it was disdain. For Dylan, who had endured boos, critics, and even abandonment by folk purists, words like these usually rolled off his back. But Reed's attack struck differently. Dylan could respect disagreement. What he could not forgive was ridicule, especially coming from an artist who, in his eyes, had traveled down roads Dylan himself had cleared. To Dylan, Lou Reed's success as a provocateur was made possible by the very doors he had already broken open: the freedom to experiment, to reject tradition, to rewrite the rules of what music could be. For Reed to then turn around and mock him felt not only disrespectful, but ungrateful. Dylan's response was not loud. He did not call Reed out in interviews or pen a biting song to put him in his place. Instead, he wielded his sharpest weapon: silence. Reed's name disappeared from Dylan's world. For decades, Dylan never mentioned him in liner notes, never nodded to him in speeches, never gave him the smallest acknowledgement in the countless interviews where he often spoke about his peers. Reed did not exist in Dylan's universe anymore. The erasure was so complete that it almost seemed like a running joke, until the moment that proved it was not. In the early 1990s, a Rolling Stone journalist brought up Lou Reed during an interview, perhaps expecting Dylan to offer some insight into Reed's influence or share an anecdote about his music. Instead, Dylan looked up, took a drag from his cigarette, and asked simply, "Who?" Then he smiled. It was not a slip. It was not ignorance. It was a cold, calculated dismissal, the kind that cuts sharper than any insult. To Reed's fans, it seemed petty. To Dylan, it was justice. What makes this feud unique is the way Dylan handled it compared to others. With Joan Baez, he cut ties quietly, but allowed the memory of their shared past to remain in the cultural conversation. With Eric Clapton, he kept things distant but cordial. But with Lou Reed, Dylan erased him completely, as though acknowledging him at all would grant legitimacy to the insult. In doing so, Dylan did not just reject Reed as a peer. He reduced him to nothing more than a passing name, an afterthought not worth remembering. To this day, Dylan's dismissal of Reed remains one of the most infamous non-feuds in music history. A clash not fought with words or blows but with silence, weaponized in a way only Dylan could manage. Yet for all the finality of that silence, there was one feud where Dylan could not stay quiet, because when Frank Zappa turned his biting sarcasm toward Dylan, the confrontation played out face to face. That night in Laurel Canyon would prove that Dylan's patience for mockery had limits. Those limits were tested when Zappa smirked in his direction. Frank Zappa. Frank Zappa was unlike anyone else in music. He was not just a guitarist or a band leader. He was a provocateur, a satirist, a man who thrived on confrontation. While others sought applause or critical validation, Zappa seemed to relish the uncomfortable silence after a cutting remark, the sting left hanging in the air after one of his sarcastic jabs. For decades, he mocked politicians, record labels, cultural norms, and even the fans who adored him. But when his sharp tongue turned toward Bob Dylan, the fallout was something different. Dylan was not just another musician for Zappa to tease. He was an institution. When Zappa attacked that institution, the results were explosive. Throughout the 70s and 80s, Zappa repeatedly used Dylan as a target in interviews. He ridiculed Dylan's singing voice, calling it a tragic accident, and suggesting that millions of fans had been tricked into believing it carried genius. He dismissed Dylan's lyrics as pseudo-intellectual ramblings, the kind of words that sounded profound only if you did not think too hard about them. Perhaps most cutting of all, Zappa laughed at Dylan's fan base, painting them as brainwashed sheep who mistook confusion for enlightenment. For most artists, these remarks could have been brushed off as Zappa being Zappa, a brilliant musician who enjoyed needling sacred cows, but Dylan did not see it that way. To him, art was sacred, and respect between artists was non-negotiable. Zappa's sarcasm was not clever wordplay, it was humiliation dressed up as wit. The tension finally boiled over one night in the 80s at a party in Laurel Canyon. It was one of those legendary gatherings where musicians, poets, and producers mingled over drinks and whispered about future collaborations. Both Dylan and Zappa were in attendance. A mutual friend, aware of the barbs that had flown for years, decided to try and mend the rift. He approached Dylan, suggested an introduction, and guided him toward Zappa. The room seemed to pause, sensing the weight of the moment. Dylan stood there, arms crossed, eyes cool, waiting. Zappa smirked, lifted his glass, and without missing a beat, delivered the line that made everyone freeze. "I hear silence is your best verse." The room laughed nervously. For Zappa, it was another clever quip, a joke at the expense of one of music's biggest names. But for Dylan, it was the final straw. He did not say a word. He did not shake Zappa's hand. He did not offer a half-hearted laugh to smooth things over. Instead, he turned, walked out of the house, and disappeared into the night, leaving the party behind him. To some, it seemed like an overreaction. To others, it was vintage Dylan, a man who never played by the expected rules, who valued dignity above appearances, and who would rather walk away than indulge someone he believed had crossed a line. In the years that followed, Dylan never spoke about Zappa again. He did not fire back in interviews, did not attempt to defend himself, did not even acknowledge the feud. His silence became the story. Those who knew Dylan understood what it meant. The cold shoulder was not indifference, it was punishment. Zappa could hurl insults for decades, but Dylan's refusal to engage turned those barbs into echoes, left hanging in the void with no one to answer them. The clash between Zappa and Dylan was about more than personal insult. It was about two philosophies colliding. Zappa thrived on tearing down, mocking everything sacred. Dylan, though often cryptic, believed in the weight of art, in the unspoken code of respect between those who dared to create. When Zappa mocked him, he was not just mocking a voice or a lyric, he was mocking the very idea that music could carry meaning. For Dylan, that was unacceptable. But while Zappa's sarcasm bruised Dylan's pride, the next fracture cut even deeper. It was not with a loudmouth provocateur, but with a man Dylan once admired above nearly all others, Leonard Cohen, the poet whose words Dylan once praised, only to later feel betrayed by them. Leonard Cohen. Among all the names on Dylan's hidden list, Leonard Cohen may be the most surprising. Unlike Zappa, Cohen was not sarcastic or dismissive in public. Unlike Lou Reed, he did not mock Dylan in interviews. In fact, Dylan once offered Cohen what may have been his highest public compliment. He called him the highest level of songwriting, a rare declaration from a man who almost never handed out praise to his peers. The admiration seemed genuine, and for a while it was. Both men were outsiders who turned words into weapons. Dylan's imagery was surreal, restless and jagged. Cohen's writing was quiet, restrained and drenched in spiritual longing. To fans, they were two sides of the same coin, the restless rebel and the monk-like poet. But beneath the respect ran something more complicated. Dylan admired Cohen, but he also saw in him a rival, someone whose dark mystique threatened to eclipse his own mythology. The tension began to surface in the late 60s. Dylan was recovering from his near-fatal motorcycle crash, pulling back from the public eye just as Cohen's career began to blossom. While Dylan withdrew, Cohen's haunting ballads, songs like Suzanne and Bird on the Wire, started to capture the world's imagination. Critics and fans alike hailed him as the next great poet of music. Some whispered that Cohen had become what Dylan once was, the voice of meaning in a chaotic world. For Dylan, who had always defined himself as the restless innovator, this subtle shift in attention was hard to ignore. It was not jealousy exactly, it was something more uncomfortable. The sense that Cohen's stillness, his quiet brooding presence, was being held up as more authentic, more profound, more eternal than Dylan's own restless, ever-changing voice. The real fracture came not from silence, but from words. In an interview in the early 70s, Cohen reportedly remarked that Dylan's early songs were juvenile compared to mature poets. To Cohen, It was not meant as a direct insult. He was speaking broadly about the difference between youthful expression and seasoned artistry. But to Dylan, it read like betrayal disguised as philosophy. Here was a man he had praised, a man he had defended as one of the greatest, dismissing the very foundation of his career as childish. Dylan did not fire back in the press. He did not confront Cohen publicly. That was not his way. But those who knew him understood. Dylan never forgot an insult, especially when it came from someone he had once admired. For the rest of their careers, the dynamic between the two men remained tense and strangely formal. They would cross paths at events, exchange polite words, even appear in the same circles, but the warmth was gone. Dylan's respect was never the same. When Leonard Cohen passed away in 2016, fans expected Dylan to write something profound, something that honored their shared legacy as the twin poets of 20th century music. Instead, they got 3 short lines. No emotional reflection, no personal story, no acknowledgement of Cohen's influence, just a hollow, almost perfunctory statement. For Dylan, that silence spoke louder than any tribute ever could. What makes this fracture so haunting is what it reveals about Dylan's relationships with his peers. He was not threatened by competition, he thrived on it. What he could not forgive was when admiration soured into condescension. Cohen, in Dylan's eyes, had crossed that line. By minimizing Dylan's early songs, he had also minimized the restless young man Dylan once was, the voice that had ignited an entire generation. That wound cut deeper than mockery, deeper than satire, deeper than silence. But if Cohen's remark left Dylan feeling betrayed, the next name on his hidden list left him feeling abandoned. Because when Michael Bloomfield walked away, Dylan was not just losing a collaborator, he was losing the guitarist who helped change the course of his career. Michael Bloomfield. If Leonard Cohen's words left Dylan bruised, Michael Bloomfield's actions cut even deeper. Because this was not just about respect or rivalry, it was about trust and abandonment. Bloomfield was not a critic, was not a rival poet, was not someone Dylan had to impress. He was a collaborator, a guitarist whose raw electric sound helped Dylan change the face of music forever. When Dylan walked on stage at Newport in 1965 with an electric guitar, the boos rang out, but so did Bloomfield's sharp, searing riffs. Together, they took folk music, plugged it in, and launched an entirely new era. Dylan's Highway 61 Revisited, a record that redefined what rock could sound like, was built on Bloomfield's electricity. To Dylan, their work together was not just successful, it was sacred. But soon after, Bloomfield slipped away. He turned down Dylan's offers to tour, dodged recording sessions, and disappeared into his own world. Some said the pressure of fame overwhelmed him. Others pointed to his growing struggles with drugs. Whatever the reason, to Dylan it felt personal. At the exact moment Dylan needed Bloomfield most, when he was reinventing himself in front of a hostile audience, his guitarist, his ally, vanished. Dylan, who valued loyalty above all else, could not understand it. In his mind, walking away was not just withdrawal, it was betrayal. The fracture widened. As the years passed, Bloomfield began giving interviews where he downplayed Dylan's role in their collaboration. In some accounts he went further, suggesting that he had been the one to give Dylan the edge, that his guitar work was the true spark that transformed folk into rock. To outsiders, these might have seemed like the boasts of a man protecting his own legacy. To Dylan, they were something far worse, an attempt to rewrite history. Dylan believed their partnership had been equal, 2 artists feeding off each other's energy. But Bloomfield's words turned it into a story, where Dylan was the passenger, not the driver. That stung. By the time Bloomfield's career declined in the 1970s, Dylan had already moved on. He never spoke of him with the same warmth again. The admiration in his voice when talking about Bloomfield's playing disappeared, replaced by silence. The man who had once been at the center of Dylan's transformation was erased, much like Lou Reed and others before him. When Bloomfield died in 1981, at just 37 years old, Dylan did acknowledge him, but only in passing. There was no lengthy tribute, no heartfelt remembrance, just a few short words that felt more like obligation than grief. For fans, the distance was baffling. Bloomfield had been one of Dylan's most important collaborators, a musician who helped usher in a new sound that defined the 60s. But for Dylan, the story was different. He did not just lose a guitarist. He lost faith in someone he trusted, someone who had stood beside him during one of the most pivotal moments of his career, and then left him to carry the weight alone. In Dylan's mind, Bloomfield did not just abandon a bandmate, he abandoned the mission. Unlike other names on Dylan's list, this fracture carried a particular sting. Bloomfield was not a rival, was not an enemy, was not a critic. He was supposed to be family. When family walks away, the silence that follows is heavier than any insult could ever be. But if Bloomfield's absence left Dylan feeling abandoned, the final name on his list revealed a fracture that went deeper than any collaborator or friend. Because when it came to Paul McCartney, Dylan's frustration was not about betrayal at all. It was about respect, and the one Beatle he never truly saw as his equal. Paul McCartney. Of all the names on Dylan's quiet list, Paul McCartney may be the one that fans least expect. On the surface, there was no bitter falling out, no screaming match, no obvious betrayal. In fact, Dylan and McCartney often spoke with polite admiration for one another. They even shared a stage a handful of times and were photographed together during the wild days of the 60s. But underneath that veneer of civility, Dylan never felt the same connection to Paul that he had with John Lennon. Over time, what started as quiet distance hardened into something closer to disdain. Dylan had always gravitated toward Lennon. He saw in John a kindred spirit, rebellious, sharp-tongued, always eager to challenge authority. Lennon's darkness, his sarcasm, his willingness to say the uncomfortable thing, mirrored Dylan's own restless drive. McCartney, by contrast, was polished. He wrote the kind of songs that topped charts, the kind of melodies families could hum together in the car. He was pop genius personified. Dylan respected the craft, but he never saw fire in it. In Dylan's world, music was not supposed to be safe. It was supposed to be dangerous, unsettling, even uncomfortable. McCartney's sweetness, his eagerness to please, represented everything Dylan had spent his career running away from. The divide became clear in the late 1980s when Paul made what seemed like an offhand remark but landed like a slap. In a magazine interview, McCartney quipped that Dylan was not writing songs people could remember anymore. To many, it sounded like mild criticism, an observation about Dylan's increasingly complex, abstract lyrics compared to the sing-along simplicity of his earlier hits. But to Dylan, it was devastating. Here was one of the most famous musicians alive, a fellow icon, essentially dismissing the later half of his career as forgettable. Dylan's songs of that era were deeply personal, filled with shadows and nuance. They were not meant to be catchy jingles, they were scars etched into music. To have them brushed aside by McCartney felt not only insulting, but shallow. The fallout was subtle, but unmistakable. Dylan abruptly pulled out of a proposed joint tour with McCartney, offering vague excuses about timing and schedules. Insiders knew the truth. Dylan had taken Paul's words personally, and once that happened, reconciliation was impossible. In private, Dylan was even blunter. According to those close to him, he once remarked, "Paul writes love letters, I write scars." It was a cutting distinction, one that summed up exactly how Dylan viewed McCartney's place in music. He respected the fame, admired the technical brilliance, but he did not see him as a peer in the deeper sense. To Dylan, McCartney was melody without meaning. The divide never truly healed, though they remained civil in public. The warmth was gone. McCartney would occasionally speak glowingly of Dylan, praising his influence and his artistry. Dylan, when asked, would offer polite nods but nothing more. It was as if in his mind, Lennon had been the Beatle worth wrestling with, the one whose shadow and spirit lingered. McCartney was the other half, brilliant but too polished, too safe, too willing to play to the crowd. For fans, the distance was puzzling. Why would not Dylan embrace one of the few men who could understand the pressures of global superstardom? Why not cherish a friendship with someone who knew what it meant to carry an entire generation's expectations on his shoulders? The answer lay in Dylan's values. To him, music was not about popularity or charm. It was about truth, even if that truth was ugly. McCartney's genius was undeniable, but Dylan did not respect the safety of it. When Paul publicly dismissed the songs Dylan had poured his soul into, the final thread snapped. In the end, Dylan did not hate Paul McCartney. He simply did not see him. He respected the fame but not the fire, admired the melodies but not the meaning. For Dylan, that absence of recognition was just as final as any feud. With McCartney, Dylan's silent list of betrayals came full circle. Not just rivals and enemies, but friends, lovers, collaborators, and icons who reflected back pieces of himself. What those fractures revealed was not just about who Dylan rejected, it was about who he refused to become. When you look at the names together, they do not make sense at first. Eric Clapton, Joan Baez, Lou Reed, Frank Zappa, Leonard Cohen, Michael Bloomfield, Paul McCartney, legends in their own right, each of them tied to Dylan in ways that defined entire eras of music. They were not random enemies, were not faceless critics, were not journalists chasing headlines. They were friends, collaborators, peers, and sometimes lovers. That is exactly what makes the list so haunting. These were not casual grudges. They were fractures born out of trust, loyalty, and intimacy. To understand Dylan's hidden list is to understand how he saw himself and how he defined the boundaries of respect. Every name carried meaning beyond the feud. Clapton was not just another guitarist. He represented the fear of being replaced, of watching another peer reach for the crown Dylan had worked so hard to build. Joan Baez was not just a former lover. She symbolized the idealist Dylan once was, the activist voice he walked away from when he chose surreal poetry over protest songs. Lou Reed was not just a provocateur, he was the mocking shadow of Dylan's own influence, proof that his revolution could be twisted into ridicule. Frank Zappa was not just a sarcastic showman, he embodied the very idea Dylan despised, that music was nothing but satire, stripped of dignity. Leonard Cohen was not just a fellow poet, he was a mirror, reflecting back Dylan's own fears of inadequacy, of being dismissed as juvenile when compared to a more mature voice. Michael Bloomfield was not just a guitarist, he was a brother in arms, someone Dylan trusted with his most important reinvention, only to watch him walk away and rewrite history without him. Paul McCartney was not just a Beatle, he was the polished perfection Dylan rejected, a reminder of everything he refused to become, no matter the fame it brought. In truth, Dylan's list is not about anger, it is about identity. Each name marks a turning point, a decision Dylan made to sever ties not just with people, but with versions of himself he no longer recognized. The activist tied to Baez, the wounded collaborator tied to Bloomfield, the rival poet tied to Cohen, the insecure artist Clapton thought he could replace. In rejecting them, Dylan was not just cutting people out of his life, he was redefining who he was, again and again, until only the version of Dylan he could live with remained. Now, at 84, Dylan is not out for revenge. He is not seeking applause, sympathy, or headlines. He is simply telling the truth as he sees it, quietly but firmly, with the same haunting clarity that has always defined him. To some, these fractures look like bitterness. To others, they look like self-preservation. Maybe they are both. But what is undeniable is that each name on the list reveals not just who Dylan turned against, but what he valued most: loyalty, respect, and authenticity. The question left hanging is this: which of these wounds still lingers? Which betrayal still echoes when Dylan picks up his guitar late at night, strumming chords only he knows? Does he think of Baez when he plays a protest tune? Does Clapton's ambition still sting? Does Cohen's remarks still haunt him? We may never know, because Dylan has always left more unsaid than spoken. But what is clear is this: his list was not about enemies, it was about ghosts. Ghosts of friendships, ghosts of rivalries, ghosts of the man he used to be. Each fracture tells a story not just of betrayal, but of transformation. Every time Dylan turned away from someone he once trusted, he was also turning away from a piece of his former self: the folk purist who stood with Baez, the collaborator who trusted Bloomfield, the poet who admired Cohen, the musician who respected Clapton. In the end, Dylan's hidden list reveals the price of becoming a legend. It is not just about the music you create or the stages you conquer. It is about the relationships you sacrifice, the bridges you burn, the people you leave behind in your relentless pursuit of artistic truth. Dylan chose authenticity over friendship, art over comfort, evolution over loyalty. Whether that makes him a visionary or simply stubborn depends on your perspective. But one thing is certain: at 84, Bob Dylan remains exactly who he has always been, a man who would rather stand alone with his convictions than compromise his vision for the sake of keeping the peace. His list was not a collection of enemies, it was a map of his journey, marked by the people who could not follow where his restless spirit led him. In choosing his art over everything else, Dylan created some of the most powerful music of the 20th century, but he also created a loneliness that only he truly understands. The ghosts on his list are not just the people he turned away from. They are the versions of himself he left behind. And maybe in the end, that is the real tragedy of Bob Dylan's hidden list. Not that he lost these relationships, but that in protecting his art, he lost pieces of his own humanity along the way. Now it is your turn. Which name on Dylan's list surprises you most? Which of these fractures do you think hurt him the deepest? Which even now might remain unresolved? The legend may have spoken, but the conversation is far from over.